In 1946, Heman Sweat, a black man, applied for admission to the University of Texas Law School. Texas state law restricted access to the university to whites, so Sweat was rejected. He took UT Law to court, so the university established a law school at Texas Southern University for black students. The case reached the Supreme Court, where they had to decide, did the state of Texas violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by refusing to admit Sweat? In a unanimous decision, the court ruled yes, and that UT Law must admit Sweat under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. They added that the new school at Texas Southern was unequal to UT Law, and that the separation from the majority of law students harmed his ability to compete in the legal arena. In 1954, the NAACP challenged public school segregation in the state of Kansas. Thurgood Marshall argued on behalf of Linda Brown and a group of other black children who wanted to attend white schools. The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white children are unconstitutional. This overturns the 1896 case known as Plessy v. Ferguson, which previously established the doctrine of separate but equal. The Warren Court stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Unfortunately, it provided no method for desegregating public schools and ordered the states to desegregate with all deliberate speed. Tired after a long day of work as a seamstress in a department store, Rosa Parks started a revolution by refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. On segregated buses, seats near the front were given to white passengers. Parks was arrested and fined $10. Organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Montgomery bus boycott demanded that black passengers be treated with courtesy and that seating should become first come, first served. For 1 year, most of the buses in Montgomery ran nearly empty as African Americans walked and carpooled to work. Finally, the Supreme Court ordered the Alabama segregation laws unconstitutional. In 1957, the NAACP registered a group of 9 African American students to attend the all-white Little Rock Central High School. Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, blocked them from attending the school with the Arkansas National Guard. After a couple of weeks, President Eisenhower ordered the 101st Airborne Division of the U.S. Army and federalized the Arkansas National Guard to escort the students into the school and allow them to attend. Those students became known as the Little Rock Nine. Remember that Truman's foreign policy that started at the beginning of the Cold War was known as containment. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, wanted to push containment even further. He contended that the U.S. should push the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China even further. He argued that if the U.S. pushed the communist powers to the edge of war, they would back down because of American nuclear superiority. This policy became known as brinkmanship. Secretary of State Dulles also pushed for greater reliance on nuclear weapons and air power, and spending less on conventional forces of the Army and the Navy. He called this massive retaliation. In theory, this would save money, help balance the federal budget, and increase pressure on potential enemies. Nuclear weapons did prove to be a deterrent against the superpowers fighting an all-out war, but such weapons could not prevent small brushfire wars from breaking out in the developing world, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Part of the new look in Eisenhower's conduct of U.S. foreign policy was the growing use of undercover intervention in the internal politics of other nations. He would use the new CIA to conduct these covert or undercover operations around the world. This seemed less objectionable than employing U.S. troops and also proved to be less expensive. In the Middle East, the U.S. had the difficult balancing act of maintaining friendly ties with the oil-rich Arab states while at the same time supporting the new state of Israel. Israel was created in 1948 under the UN auspices, after a civil war in the British Mandate territory of Palestine left the land divided between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israel's neighbors, including Egypt, had fought unsuccessfully to prevent the Jewish state from being formed. In 1953, the CIA played a major role in helping to overthrow a government in Iran that had tried to nationalize the holding of foreign oil companies. The overthrow of the elected government allowed for the return of Reza Pahlavi as Shah, or monarch of Iran. The Shah's return provided the West with favorable oil prices and made enormous purchases of American guns. During Eisenhower's presidency, the Suez Crisis posed a potential threat to peace between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Egyptian General Nasser asked the U.S. for funds to build the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. The U.S. refused because Egypt threatened Israel's security. Instead, the Soviet Union agreed to provide limited financing for the project. Seeking another source for funds, Nasser will precipitate an international crisis in July of 1956, known as the Suez Crisis. He will seize and nationalize the British and French-owned Suez Canal. The loss of the canal threatened Western Europe's supply line to Middle Eastern oil. In response, Britain, France, and Israel launched a surprise attack against Egypt and retook the canal. Furious at being kept in the dark, Eisenhower led a UN resolution condemning the invasion of Egypt, which forced the invading forces to withdraw. Britain and France would not play a major role in the world affairs again. After the Suez Crisis, the U.S. was the only major Western influence in the Middle East, but it faced a growing Soviet influence in Egypt and Syria. To curb that influence, Eisenhower pledged economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. This was known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, which built on the Truman Doctrine. Eisenhower will first apply his doctrine in Lebanon in 1958 by sending 14,000 Marines there to prevent the outbreak of a civil war between Christians and Muslims. In Eisenhower's last year of office, 1960, the Arab nations of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran joined Venezuela to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. This will prove troubling to future presidents as Western countries become more dependent on oil. Some of the most serious Cold War challenges would come from Asia and Southeast Asia. Soon after his inauguration, Eisenhower kept his promise and visited the troops in Korea. Diplomacy, the threat of nuclear war, and the sudden death of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union finally convinced China and the North Koreans to agree on an armistice, or ceasefire, in 1953. Korea would remain divided at the 38th parallel with a demilitarized zone separating the North from the South. However, no formal treaty was ever signed. Next came Indochina. Before World War II, Indochina was a French colony. During World War II, they lost it to Japan. After the war, they tried to reclaim it. The Communist Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, launched a guerrilla war against the French. Starting in 1950, this will be the next confrontation in the Cold War. The U.S. will send military aid to the French to prevent the spread of communism, while China and the Soviet Union will help Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, the French will lose at Dien Bien Phu and be forced to surrender. That year, all parties will meet in Switzerland and agree to the Geneva Accords. France agrees to give up Indochina, which is split up into the independent nations of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam is to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, which would also be demilitarized, just like the 38th parallel in Korea, until a general election can be held. North Vietnam will be supported by the Soviet Union and China. South Vietnam will be supported by the U.S. Between 1955 and 1961, Eisenhower will send over $1 billion to prop up the anti-communist South. He will justify this with the domino theory. This is the idea that if one country in Southeast Asia falls to communism, it will spread throughout the region, as well as Australia and New Zealand. To prevent the fall of communism in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, Secretary of State Dulles put together a regional defense pact called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, agreeing to defend one another in the case of attack within their region. 8 nations will sign the pact in 1954: the U.S., Great Britain, France, Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. Latin America also proved to be a region with its own challenges. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA overthrew a democratically elected government. The Guatemalan government had seized some unused land from the United Fruit Company to redistribute to poor farmers. This action threatened American business interests and seemed to be a leftist or communist policy, so Eisenhower sent in the CIA. This action had serious consequences, pushing Guatemala into a 40-year civil war that killed thousands of people. Once again, instead of sending the military, Eisenhower will continue his use of covert action to solve Cold War problems. U.S. opposition to communism seemed to drive Washington to support corrupt and often ruthless dictators, especially in Latin America. This produced growing anti-American feelings, which is shown in 1958 when angry crowds in Venezuela attacked Vice President Nixon's motorcade during his goodwill tour of South America. The most alarming Cold War development during Eisenhower years occurred in this hemisphere. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. He quickly nationalized American-owned businesses and properties in Cuba. Eisenhower retaliated by cutting off U.S. trade with Cuba. That's when Castro turned to the Soviet Union and created a communist totalitarian state, 90 miles from Florida. In the spirit of Geneva, Eisenhower proposed allowing both the Soviet Union and the U.S. the ability to spy on each other to try and prevent all-out war. The Soviets said no, but that doesn't mean that we didn't follow through with the plan on our own. The U.S. was conducting our own high-altitude spying over the Soviet Union with a special plane to find out about their missile program. The spy plane was known as the U-2. 2 weeks before Eisenhower was supposed to meet with Khrushchev in Paris, the Soviets shot down the American U-2 spy plane. Eisenhower admitted the incident and took full responsibility after the Soviets had exposed our transgression. Khrushchev had no choice but to cancel the summit meeting in Paris. The Americans had to trade a Soviet spy to get the pilot back home.